When the 1947 partition of British India created two new independent nations, India and Pakistan, it did a lot more than just redraw a map. It actually planted the seeds of a really fierce rivalry, one that would erupt into 4 full-scale wars and pretty much shape the destiny of the entire subcontinent.
And that's the big question, right? How did this one event lead to all this conflict? The relationship between these two nuclear-armed neighbors has been defined by war. And to really understand why, we've got to go right back to the very beginning.
So, think of this timeline as our roadmap. It's going to guide us through the 4 major conflicts that have really defined this rivalry. We'll go from the mountains of Kashmir to the plains of Bengal, and then all the way back again.
The fuse for this whole thing was lit almost immediately, and right at the heart of the explosion was the unresolved status of one absolutely crucial territory, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir.
You see, there was this legal document called the Instrument of Accession. It was basically the mechanism for deciding the future of hundreds of these princely states. Their rulers had a simple choice: join India or join Pakistan. Well, in Kashmir's case, that choice, it would become the justification for war.
I mean, you have to realize Kashmir was in an incredibly tough spot. Its ruler was Hindu, but most of the people he governed were Muslim. At first, he was actually dreaming of independence for Kashmir, but he found himself just caught between these two powerful new countries, with totally competing political forces pulling him apart from inside his own state.
And as you can probably guess, this complex political dilemma, it didn't stay political for long. In just a matter of months, it blew up into the very first war between the brand new countries of India and Pakistan. And things happened fast. It started with a local rebellion in a region called Punch, but that quickly spiraled when tribal militias backed by Pakistan poured across the border. With his state about to collapse, the Maharaja finally made his choice. He signed the papers to officially join India, and that gave the Indian Army the legal grounds it needed to fly in and defend the territory.
Now, the war didn't end with a clear winner. It ended with a ceasefire brokered by the UN. And that ceasefire line became what we know today as the line of control, or the LOC. It's important to remember this is a temporary dividing line that has since become one of the most heavily militarized frontiers on the entire planet.
So the outcome was basically a divided Kashmir. India ended up securing the most populous and strategic regions, like the Kashmir Valley. But the conflict itself, it was frozen, not solved. And that just set the stage for decades of more tension to come.
All right, so the next phase of this rivalry saw 2 more wars, and these conflicts would not only go back to the battlegrounds of Kashmir, they would ultimately lead to the creation of an entirely new country, redrawing the map of South Asia forever.
So why a second war? Well, by 1965, Pakistan's leadership was feeling pretty confident. Their military had been modernized with American help, and they thought India's army was still weak after a tough loss against China in 1962. They basically saw a window of opportunity to try and seize Kashmir by force.
The spark for this war was something called Operation Gibraltar. The plan was to sneak troops in to start a popular uprising, but it completely backfired. The local Kashmiris actually reported the infiltrators to the Indian Army, which then kicked off a full-scale conventional war. In the end, it was a stalemate with no real changes to the borders, but it just made the mistrust between the two countries even deeper.
Now, just 6 years later, we get a conflict that was fundamentally different. I mean, for the first and only time, the main battlefield wasn't Kashmir. It was a region over 1,000 miles away, East Pakistan.
To get this war, you have to understand that Pakistan was a country in 2 halves, separated by India. West Pakistan dominated everything: the government, the military, the economy. But East Pakistan, even though it had more people, felt totally oppressed, both culturally and economically, especially over the government trying to force the Urdu language on them instead of their native Bengali.
Everything came to a head in 1970. An East Pakistani party actually won the national election, but the military leadership in West Pakistan just refused to hand over power. Instead, they launched Operation Searchlight, a horrific military crackdown that led to genocide. This forced millions of refugees to pour into India, creating a massive humanitarian crisis that finally pulled India into the war.
And the result was stunningly swift and decisive. In just 13 days, the Pakistani army in the east surrendered. This was a huge moment. The war ended with the birth of a brand new nation, Bangladesh, and it really established India's military dominance in the region.
Okay, let's jump forward a couple of decades to 1999.
The fourth major war erupts. This one was fought in some of the most dangerous, treacherous terrain on Earth. But this time, there was a terrifying new element in the mix. Both India and Pakistan were now declared nuclear powers.
And the irony here is just staggering. This war began just months after a historic peace initiative. The Indian Prime Minister had actually traveled to Pakistan, and both leaders signed something called the Lahore Declaration, committing to solve their issues peacefully.
But, and this is a huge but, while the politicians were talking peace, the Pakistani military had very different plans. They were secretly sending soldiers disguised as militants to seize strategic mountain peaks on the Indian side of the line of control, hoping to cut off a key Indian highway. And once again, can you guess who spotted the intruders first? It was local civilians, this time shepherds. India responded with Operation Vijay, a massive military operation to retake those peaks. And this was brutal, high-altitude warfare, with the Indian Army and Air Force fighting tooth and nail to dislodge entrenched enemies from mountaintops like the really critical Tiger Hill.
The outcome was a clear military and diplomatic victory for India. All the occupied territory was reclaimed, and Pakistan faced intense international pressure, especially from the U.S., to withdraw its forces completely.
So after 4 major wars, where does that leave us? Well, while the large-scale fighting has stopped, the core issues that started it all, they haven't gone away. And this has created a legacy of persistent, simmering tension.
And this is pretty much the state of play today. Kashmir is still the central point of contention, the line of control is still a site of regular clashes, and looming over all of it is the fact that both countries have nuclear weapons, which makes any future conflict incredibly dangerous for the entire world.
You know, decades of war have proven that military solutions seem to only lead to more tension. And that leaves us with the ultimate question. After all this, what is the path forward to a lasting peace?